The silence was deafening. Not the kind of silence that brings peace and comfort to weary souls searching for rest, but the hollow, suffocating quiet that follows when a child simply vanishes into thin air without warning or explanation of any kind. At Magnolia Park in the heart of Oregon, a pink, glittery backpack lay abandoned by the swings, its contents scattered like breadcrumbs leading nowhere and everywhere at once across the playground surface. Inside, a half-empty juice box still dripped onto the wood chips below. As if time itself had frozen at the exact moment, 9-year-old Lily Walker disappeared without leaving a single trace behind her small frame. The playground equipment stood motionless against the darkening sky above, the swings moving gently in a breeze that seemed to whisper ancient secrets no one could understand or interpret correctly in their rising panic. By 5:10 p.m., yellow tape had transformed the cheerful neighborhood park into an active crime scene, and professional search teams were forming systematic grids across the surrounding woods and open fields beyond the tree line. Neighbors emerged from their homes, carrying flashlights and grim determination. Teachers abandoned their evening plans to join the desperate hunt for answers, and teenagers put aside their phones to help comb through every bush, every shed, every shadow that might hide a frightened little girl. But as darkness crept across the small Oregon town like a predator stalking its unsuspecting prey through familiar streets, the voices calling Lily's name began to fade into exhausted whispers. The flashlight beams grew weaker against the encroaching night, and hope started slipping away like sand through increasingly desperate fingers. Officer Daniel Ruiz had seen this exact nightmare before, too many times in his 15 years of dedicated service, each case branded into his memory like a scar that never fully healed or stopped aching in quiet moments of reflection. But this time was different because sitting beside his patrol car was Ekko, a black and tan German shepherd whose intelligent eyes held something most people couldn't see and wouldn't believe, even if they witnessed it firsthand during their darkest hours. While other dogs relied on impressive speed and flashy tricks to impress their handlers and spectators watching nearby, Ekko possessed an almost supernatural ability to sense what others completely missed, to pause at doors that hid terrible secrets, to stare into spaces where danger lurked unseen and undetected by human senses. When search teams finally gave up and went home to their warm beds and worried families waiting anxiously for news that might never come, Ekko lingered in the cold darkness, his powerful instincts pulling him towards something mysterious that defied all logic and reason completely and utterly in ways that challenged every scientific explanation known to humanity and beyond all human understanding or comprehension ever before. For hours, Ekko circled the same spot near the concrete storm drain, his behavior growing more agitated with each pass around the darkened perimeter. The search supervisors had already dismissed the drainage tunnel as too small, too obvious, already checked and cleared by multiple teams throughout the evening hours. But Ekko's low whimper wasn't the sound of a confused animal caught up in excitement and chaos. It was the mourning cry of a dog who knew something terrible was hidden just beyond human perception and understanding. As midnight rain began to fall and the last volunteer vehicles disappeared into the darkness, their red taillights fading like dying embers against the black night, Officer Ruiz made a decision that would haunt him forever and change everything he thought he knew about trust and instinct. The next morning, he returned to the park alone, drawn by Ekko's unshakable conviction and the haunting image of that pink backpack left behind like a tombstone marking innocence lost to shadows and fear. With no media crews, no supervisors, no protocols to follow, just a man and his canine partner standing at the mouth of a concrete pipe that seemed to swallow light itself and exhale only emptiness and despair. Ekko's entire body went rigid as he stared into the blackness, not alert, but pleading, as if begging his human partner to trust what couldn't be seen or heard or explained by any manual or training program ever written by experts. When Ruiz finally knelt and peered into the tunnel with his flashlight, the beam revealed nothing but damp concrete and scattered leaves, the same empty void that had been checked and dismissed by every other searcher the night before during their systematic search. But then, in that split second between hope and despair, something moved in the darkness deeper within the tunnel, not an animal or debris blown by wind, but a small, pale hand sliding slowly into view from behind a hidden bend in the concrete passage. The fingers were trembling with the last fragments of strength, reaching desperately toward a light that might mean salvation or might mean nothing at all to a child who had been waiting in that concrete tomb for nearly 18 hours. The hand belonged to someone whose survival depended entirely on whether a human would finally listen to what a dog had been trying to say all along, someone who had been praying in the darkness that rescue would come before it was too late for anyone to save her precious life from certain doom. What Officer Ruiz didn't know was that this discovery would be only the beginning of a nightmare that stretched across multiple states, involving a predator who had been hunting children for years, and a German shepherd whose supernatural instincts would soon uncover a network of horror that law enforcement had never imagined could exist in their quiet communities and peaceful neighborhoods throughout the entire region and beyond. All expectations or imagination ever before. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel Canine Loyal Souls, where we uncover true stories of animals' bravery you won't believe until you see it. In the world of canine law enforcement, there are dogs that follow commands, and there are dogs that seem to possess an almost otherworldly understanding of human suffering. Ekko belonged to the latter category, a black and tan German shepherd whose story would challenge everything we think we know about the bond between man and animal, about intuition versus logic, and about the lengths one dog would go to save children who had been written off as lost forever. This isn't just another feel-good rescue story about a heroic police dog. This is the documented account of how one canine's supernatural instincts exposed a multi-state network of child predators, saved multiple lives, and forced an entire law enforcement community to confront the reality that sometimes the most important evidence comes not from forensic labs or witness testimonies, but from the unwavering conviction of a four-legged partner who refuses to give up when everyone else has gone home. Officer Daniel Ruiz had worked with search and rescue dogs for over a decade, but he had never encountered anything like Ekko's ability to sense danger, to pause at exactly the right moment, to communicate urgency without making a sound. While other dogs relied on training protocols and reward systems, Ekko seemed to operate on a different frequency entirely, one that connected him directly to the fear and desperation of missing children in ways that defied scientific explanation. The case that would make Ekko legendary began on what seemed like an ordinary Tuesday afternoon in a small Oregon town, the kind of place where children rode their bikes without helmets and parents didn't lock their doors until bedtime. But beneath the surface of this peaceful community, something dark had been watching, waiting, and planning. The key disappearance of 9-year-old Lily Walker would set in motion a chain of events that would expose not just one predator, but an entire network of individuals who had been moving through quiet neighborhoods across the Pacific Northwest, leaving behind a trail of trauma that law enforcement had failed to connect until one dog decided that the official search parameters weren't good enough. What makes this story truly extraordinary isn't just the successful rescue of multiple children, but the way Ekko's instincts repeatedly led investigators to evidence that had been overlooked, dismissed, or completely missed by conventional investigative methods. Time and again, when human logic said there was nothing more to find, Ekko would sit, whimper, and wait until someone was willing to look deeper. This is the story of how trust between a man and his dog became the key to unlocking a case that spanned years, multiple jurisdictions, and a level of evil that most people prefer to believe doesn't exist in their own backyards. It's a story about the power of persistence, the importance of listening to instincts even when they contradict official protocols, and the reminder that sometimes the most profound acts of heroism come from those who cannot speak, but refuse to remain silent when innocent lives hang in the balance. The moment Officer Ruiz saw that pale hand emerge from the darkness, time seemed to fracture into a series of hyper-focused snapshots that would replay in his mind for the rest of his career. The small fingers, dirt-stained and trembling, reached toward his flashlight beam like a prayer made manifest, and suddenly the concrete storm drain transformed from an empty tunnel into a tomb where a child had been waiting to die. Ekko's low whimper took on new meaning, as Ruiz realized his partner had been mourning not just for the missing, but for someone who was still clinging to life just beyond human perception. The rescue that followed was a masterclass in controlled panic, with Ruiz crawling halfway into the tunnel while radioing for paramedics, fire rescue, and backup, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins like liquid electricity. Lily Walker was barely conscious when they pulled her from the concrete passage, her small body wrapped in a foil emergency blanket that made her look like a fragile piece of space debris that had crash-landed in their quiet Oregon town. She was dehydrated, hypothermic, and traumatized, beyond anything a 9-year-old should ever experience, but she was alive, and that single fact would haunt the investigators who had walked past that same drain multiple times without bothering to look deeper. As the paramedics worked to stabilize her vital signs, Lily whispered something that made Ruiz's blood run cold with realization and regret. She had heard Ekko outside the tunnel, she said, and his presence had been the only thing that convinced her to stay awake during those final hours. When giving up would have been easier than continuing to hope for rescue. The media coverage that followed focused on the miraculous nature of the discovery, but completely missed the most important detail that would only become clear in the days and weeks that followed. Lily hadn't simply wandered into that tunnel and gotten lost, as the initial reports suggested. She had been chased there by someone in dark clothing, someone who had followed her after school and forced her to run for her life. Through the brush and into the storm drain where she became trapped in the darkness. When Lily finally felt safe enough to speak about what had happened, her account painted a picture that law enforcement was reluctant to accept because it meant admitting they had almost classified a predatory abduction as a simple case of a confused child who had wandered off and hidden when search teams called her name. The juice box found in her backpack wasn't the only evidence, as Ruiz would soon discover. There was another juice box, crushed and discarded, hidden in the woods beyond the park where someone had waited and watched before making their move. Ekko had tried to lead them to that evidence too, but in the chaos of the successful rescue, his additional alerts had been dismissed as residual excitement from finding Lily. It would take 3 more days of unofficial investigation, with Ruiz and Ekko returning to the scene on their own time, before they uncovered the trail of evidence that proved Lily's account and revealed the terrifying truth that a predator had been operating in their community. Someone organized enough to scout locations in advance, and methodical enough to leave behind a pattern of evidence that painted a picture of calculated hunting rather than opportunistic crime. The crushed juice box that Ekko found in the woods was just the beginning of a trail that would lead Officer Ruiz into the darkest corners of predatory behavior, where careful planning meets opportunistic evil in ways that most law enforcement agencies are not equipped to recognize or investigate. When Ruiz brought the evidence to crime analyst Mia Reynolds, her expression shifted from professional interest to genuine alarm as she spread the photographs across her desk and began connecting dots that formed a pattern too deliberate to be coincidental. The juice box wasn't random debris left by a careless child, but rather a piece of evidence that suggested someone had been conducting surveillance on Lily Walker, learning her routines, understanding her preferences, and positioning themselves to strike at the moment when she would be most vulnerable and isolated. Mia's analysis revealed that the positioning of the evidence suggested a predator who understood sightlines, escape routes, and the timing of school dismissals with the precision of someone who had done this before, possibly many times, in other locations across the region. The footprint they discovered near the flattened grass told a story of patience and calculation, someone who had waited in that spot long enough to leave an impression in the earth, watching and planning while children played just yards away, completely unaware that they were being evaluated as potential targets. When Ruiz expanded his search radius, based on Ekko's continued alerts, they uncovered a section of fence that had been deliberately modified with zip ties, creating a quick escape route that would be invisible to casual observers but perfectly positioned for someone who needed to disappear quickly if their plans were interrupted. Each piece of evidence painted a picture of a predator who had transformed a children's playground into a hunting ground, someone who understood that the key to successful abduction wasn't speed or strength, but rather careful preparation and the ability to exploit the trust and innocence that small communities took for granted. The burner phone they eventually discovered, hidden beneath a pile of rocks, contained a single photograph that sent chills through everyone who saw it, an image of the Magnolia Park sign, timestamped 2 hours before Lily's disappearance, proving that someone had been documenting their surveillance activities with the methodical approach of a professional criminal. When that phone was traced through digital forensics, it revealed connections to similar devices that had been used in reported loitering incidents near schools, daycares, and public pools across 3 different states, suggesting a level of organization and geographic scope that transformed this from a local investigation into a federal case. The realization that they were dealing with not just one predator, but potentially a network of individuals who had been moving through quiet communities for years without detection, forced law enforcement to confront the uncomfortable truth that their traditional investigative methods were completely inadequate for identifying this type of calculated, patient, and highly mobile threat. Ekko's supernatural instincts had uncovered in a matter of days what conventional law enforcement had failed to detect, despite multiple reports and incidents that should have raised red flags if anyone had been looking for the patterns that connected them. The black SUV that had been spotted in each of these locations was more than just a coincidence. It was a signature, a calling card left by someone who was confident that law enforcement would never connect the dots between small incidents in different jurisdictions, someone who had been hiding in plain sight while perfecting their hunting techniques on the most vulnerable members of society. The black SUV that had haunted the periphery of multiple crime scenes finally became more than just a ghost when Officer Ruiz and Ekko tracked it to the abandoned barn in Silverside, a discovery that transformed their investigation from reactive detective work into active predator hunting. The barn itself was a monument to calculated evil, its interior converted into a staging area where someone had been stockpiling the tools of abduction with the methodical precision of a professional criminal preparing for a long-term campaign. The plastic bins filled with zip ties, duct tape, and children's clothing weren't random collections of supplies, but rather a carefully curated arsenal designed specifically for the capture and control of young victims, each item selected for maximum efficiency and minimum detection. When Ekko refused to enter the underground tunnel, they discovered beneath the barn floor his behavior spoke volumes about what his enhanced senses had detected in that confined space, a level of fear and suffering that had soaked into the very walls and earth in ways that human investigators could never fully comprehend or document. The tunnel itself was a nightmare made manifest, reinforced with plywood and equipped with the basic necessities for keeping someone alive but completely helpless. A concrete tomb designed by someone who understood that the key to successful predation wasn't just the initial capture, but the ability to maintain control over victims for extended periods without detection. The discovery of multiple similar sites scattered across rural areas suggested a network of predators who had been operating with the organizational structure of a business, complete with supply chains, communication protocols, and geographic territories that allowed them to move victims between locations while staying ahead of law enforcement investigations that were hampered by jurisdictional boundaries and limited resources. When Ruiz finally confronted the man near the storage shed, watching him bury evidence with the casual efficiency of someone who had performed this ritual many times before, the arrest felt less like the end of an investigation and more like the opening move in a much larger game that had been playing out in shadows for years. The photographs found in the buried bag represented more than just evidence of criminal behavior. They were trophies collected by someone who viewed children not as human beings worthy of protection, but as objects to be catalogued, evaluated, and eventually consumed by a network of individuals who had learned to hide their monstrous appetites behind the facade of ordinary suburban life. The federal interest that immediately materialized around the case spoke to the scope of the network they had uncovered, but also to the uncomfortable reality that law enforcement agencies across the country had been missing similar patterns in their own jurisdictions, patterns that might have been visible if anyone had been looking for the connections that tied seemingly unrelated incidents together into a coherent picture of organized predatory behavior. The diary that Ekko discovered hidden in the ductwork of Ruiz's own home was like finding a message in a bottle from someone who had been lost at sea, except this message had been written by a child whose disappearance had never been reported, whose suffering had never been acknowledged, and whose survival had depended on hope that rescue would eventually come from someone who was willing to listen to what a dog was trying to tell them. Samantha D., as she identified herself in the faded pages, had documented her captivity with the heartbreaking clarity of a 9-year-old who understood that writing down her experiences might be the only way to ensure that someone would eventually know what had happened to her, even if she didn't survive to tell the story herself. Her descriptions of being locked in underground spaces, of hearing footsteps above her head, and of someone who left food but never showed mercy, painted a picture of systematic abuse that had been occurring for years before Lily Walker ever set foot in Magnolia Park. The drawing at the back of the diary, a simple sketch of a dog with the words, "I heard him but he didn't find me," revealed the tragic reality that Ekko or dogs like him had been close to previous victims without ever being given the chance to complete their rescue missions. When ground-penetrating radar revealed additional underground chambers near the barn, each one showing evidence of habitation, but no current occupants, the investigation team realized they were looking at a graveyard of missed opportunities, places where children had been held while search teams passed. Overhead, without ever knowing how close they were to solving cases that had been classified as runaways or family abductions, the house with yellow stairs that appeared repeatedly in Samantha's diary became the key to unlocking an entire network of safe houses and staging areas that had been hidden in plain sight, their mundane suburban exteriors concealing basement prisons where children had been held while their captors decided their ultimate fate. The files discovered in that house represented years of meticulous record-keeping by predators who had treated child trafficking like a business enterprise, complete with detailed notes about victim preferences, transportation logistics, and customer satisfaction ratings that reduced human suffering to a series of data points and profit margins. Each box of clothing and personal items represented a child whose disappearance had been explained away by overwhelmed investigators who lacked the resources or imagination to consider that their quiet communities might be hunting grounds for an organized network of predators. The school ID cards mixed in with the other trophies served as a catalogue of victims whose faces would haunt the investigators, who finally understood that they had been fighting a war against an enemy they had never recognized, using weapons and strategies that were completely inadequate for the scope of the threat they faced. Ekko's ability to sense the residual trauma that lingered in these places long after the victims had been moved or eliminated represented a form of evidence that couldn't be quantified or presented in court, but which provided the emotional and spiritual compass that guided the investigation toward truth when conventional methods had failed completely. The arrest of the nameless man in the black SUV was supposed to be the culmination of their investigation, but his stubborn silence in federal custody only confirmed what Ruiz and Ekko had suspected all along. They had captured a single thread in a web that stretched far beyond their small Oregon community, reaching into other states where similar predators continued to operate with the confidence that comes from years of successful hunting. The man's refusal to speak, even when faced with overwhelming evidence and the possibility of life imprisonment, suggested either fanatical loyalty to his network or genuine fear of what would happen to him if he broke the code of silence that kept their organization functioning in the shadows. When additional arrests were made in other counties, based on evidence found in the ranch house files, each suspect displayed the same pattern of absolute silence, as if they had been trained to accept capture as an occupational hazard while protecting the larger operation from exposure. The foster home report from Sheridan about a man watching children near the school proved that the network was still active despite their recent losses, adapting and continuing their predatory activities even as law enforcement agencies across multiple states began connecting cases that had previously been treated as isolated incidents. Ekko's discovery of the white baseball cap hidden beneath trash bins near the school represented more than just physical evidence. It was proof that the predators had learned to be more careful about leaving traces while continuing to scout new hunting grounds with the patience and persistence that had made them so successful for so long. The single letter S found inside the cap's brim could have been a coincidence, but when combined with the other evidence and Ekko's behavioral alerts, it painted a picture of predators who had developed their own internal communication systems and identification methods that allowed them to recognize each other while remaining invisible to law enforcement. The black SUV that Ruiz and Ekko tracked through the night to the trailer park represented a moment of convergence where years of careful planning by predators collided with the supernatural instincts of a dog who refused to let evil hide in darkness. The photograph of the young girl found in the suspect's wallet wasn't just evidence of future criminal intent. It was a death sentence that had been signed by someone who viewed children as disposable commodities in a business model that had been refined through years of practice and organizational learning. Emily's rescue from the locked basement 3 counties away proved that the network's reach extended far beyond what any single jurisdiction could investigate or prosecute, requiring a level of federal coordination and resource allocation that most communities could never hope to achieve on their own. The realization that Emily had been missing for 2 months while living just hours away from multiple law enforcement agencies that were unaware of her disappearance, highlighted the fundamental weaknesses in a system that relied on jurisdictional boundaries and bureaucratic protocols rather than the kind of intuitive investigation that Ekko had been conducting from the beginning. The suspension that Ruiz received for his unauthorized fieldwork was a stark reminder that institutional loyalty often conflicts with moral obligation, forcing individual officers to choose between following orders and following their conscience when innocent lives hang in the balance. The official suspension from the sheriff's department was supposed to be a punishment, but for Officer Ruiz, it felt more like liberation from the bureaucratic constraints that had been preventing him from following Ekko's leads to their logical conclusions, allowing them to operate outside the jurisdictional boundaries and procedural limitations that had been protecting predators for years. Without the badge, Ruiz discovered that his partnership with Ekko became even more powerful because they were no longer bound by official protocols that required warrants, supervisory approval, and interdepartmental coordination that gave criminals time to disappear, while law enforcement agencies argued about proper procedures and resource allocation. The teacher from Lincoln Elementary, who reached out to them, represented a growing network of civilians who understood that sometimes the most important work happens outside official channels, in the quiet spaces where ordinary people decide to take extraordinary risks to protect children who have no other advocates. Hannah's invitation for Ekko to visit her fourth-grade class wasn't just about teaching children about bravery. It was about creating a community of awareness where ordinary citizens became the eyes and ears that law enforcement agencies had been lacking in their efforts to identify and track predatory behavior before it escalated into abduction and worse. The children's questions about whether Ekko had ever saved Ruiz revealed the profound truth that rescue is rarely a one-way transaction, that the bond between human and canine partners creates a form of mutual salvation that extends far beyond the specific cases they solve together. When the little girl whispered secrets into Ekko's ear, as if he were a confessor who could absolve her of fears she couldn't name, it became clear that his presence provided a form of emotional healing that traditional law enforcement methods could never achieve for victims who had learned to distrust the adult world that had failed to protect them. The governor's decision to create the Ekko Response Program represented more than just political recognition of their work. It was an acknowledgement that the conventional approach to child protection had fundamental flaws that required innovative solutions combining traditional law enforcement with the kind of intuitive investigation that only certain animals could provide. The requirement that dogs for the program be rescued from shelters rather than purchased from commercial breeders reflected an understanding that the most effective search and rescue animals often come from backgrounds of trauma and abandonment that give them special insight into the experiences of vulnerable children. The success stories that emerged from the first year of Ekko response operations proved that Ekko's supernatural abilities weren't unique to him, but rather represented a capacity that existed in many animals who had never been given the opportunity to demonstrate their potential for contributing to child protection efforts. The placement of retired program dogs with families of former victims created a circle of healing that extended the therapeutic benefits of human-animal bonding beyond the immediate crisis intervention into long-term recovery and emotional restoration. When 7-year-old Leah, the first child Ekko had ever found, adopted a retired canine named Ranger, she was creating more than just a pet relationship. She was establishing a connection to the network of protection that had saved her life and would continue to save other children who found themselves lost in darkness, with only hope and the sound of approaching paws to guide them towards safety and home. The morning when Ruiz found Ekko resting peacefully beneath the oak tree, facing the sunrise with his tail curled around his back legs, marked the end of an era but also the beginning of something larger than any single dog or officer could accomplish alone. Ekko's death wasn't tragic in the conventional sense because he had lived a life of purpose that most beings never achieve, saving children who would have been lost forever and exposing evil that would have remained hidden in the shadows of suburban communities across the Pacific Northwest. The funeral that followed brought together an unlikely congregation of neighbors, law enforcement officials, and the children whose lives had been touched by Ekko's supernatural instincts, creating a moment of collective recognition that heroism often comes in forms that society is too busy or too cynical to acknowledge until it's gone. The toys and flowers that appeared daily at the base of the oak tree weren't just memorials to a deceased animal, but rather offerings to a spirit that had demonstrated the power of unconditional love and unwavering determination in the face of institutional indifference and bureaucratic obstruction. When children left crayon drawings and handwritten notes expressing their gratitude for a dog who had never asked for recognition or reward, they were participating in a form of communion that transcended the usual boundaries between human and animal, creating a sacred space where innocence could honor courage without the complications that adults bring to such moments. The bench that Ruiz built beneath Ekko's tree became more than just a place for quiet reflection. It evolved into a pilgrimage site where families who had been touched by tragedy could come to remember that sometimes salvation arrives on four legs without warning or explanation, requiring only faith in things that cannot be measured or quantified by conventional standards. The new dog that Ruiz trained in Ekko's memory wasn't expected to duplicate his predecessor's supernatural abilities, but rather to continue the work of listening for sounds that others missed, watching for signs that others overlooked, and refusing to give up when conventional wisdom suggested that hope was pointless and effort was wasted. When that dog froze at the sound of a faint whimper during a routine school fire drill and discovered a 6-year-old locked in a janitor's closet, too scared to call for help, it became clear that Ekko's legacy lived on in more than just memory and sentiment. The instinct to protect the vulnerable, to sense fear where others sensed nothing, and to persist when everyone else had moved on to easier problems represented a form of spiritual inheritance that could be passed from one generation of rescue animals to the next through training. Example, and the mysterious bonds that connect all living beings who choose service over self-preservation. The Ekko response program that bore his name became a living memorial that multiplied his impact across dozens of communities, training shelter dogs to become the kind of supernatural investigators that law enforcement agencies had never known they needed until children started disappearing and conventional methods proved inadequate for finding them before it was too late. The fund that supported these efforts represented more than just financial investment in animal training. It was a commitment to the principle that protecting children requires resources, imagination, and the willingness to trust in abilities that don't fit neatly into official procedures or bureaucratic categories. The calls that continued to come to Ruiz long after his official retirement from law enforcement represented more than just requests for assistance. They were testimony to the reality that certain problems require solutions that exist outside institutional frameworks, in the spaces where individual conscience meets collective need and decides that protocol matters less than results. When detectives called asking if he and his new partner could just take a look at a case that had gone cold, they were acknowledging that sometimes the most important evidence exists in forms that can't be photographed, catalogued, or presented in court, but which can guide investigation toward truth when conventional methods have exhausted their usefulness. The teachers who requested visits weren't just looking for educational entertainment. They were recognizing that children need to understand that protection can come from unexpected sources, that heroes don't always wear uniforms or carry badges, and that sometimes the most important lesson is learning to trust instincts that adults have forgotten how to hear or value. The parents who asked if Ekko's successor could sit with their children during testimony weren't seeking publicity or sympathy. They were providing their traumatized kids with a form of emotional support that traditional therapy couldn't offer, a living reminder that some beings in the world exist solely to protect and comfort without asking for anything in return. The fact that Ruiz never charged for these services reflected his understanding that the work he and his partners were doing transcended commercial transaction, existing instead in the realm of moral obligation, where the only payment that matters is the knowledge that vulnerable people are safer, because someone was willing to step outside their comfort zone and risk everything for strangers. The school districts that began incorporating K-9 emotional support programs into their standard protocols were acknowledging that childhood trauma requires healing approaches that go beyond traditional counseling, recognizing that animals possess therapeutic abilities that humans can supplement, but never fully replace or replicate through professional training alone. The volunteers who emerged from communities where Ekko Response had operated successfully represented a multiplication effect that extended far beyond the original program, creating networks of ordinary citizens who had learned to recognize signs of predatory behavior and respond appropriately rather than hoping that someone else would take responsibility for child protection. The regional conferences where law enforcement agencies shared information about patterns they had identified through animal-assisted investigation marked a fundamental shift in how professional criminal investigators approached cases involving missing children, moving away from purely technological solutions toward hybrid approaches that combined digital forensics with intuitive investigation methods. The reduction in successful child abductions in areas where Ekko response operated wasn't just statistical improvement, it represented lives. That continued uninterrupted, families that remained whole, and communities that learned to trust in protection systems that worked even when the people running them couldn't fully explain why their methods were effective. The training manuals that began incorporating Ekko's techniques into standard K9 instruction represented institutional acceptance of approaches that had once been dismissed as unscientific, creating formal recognition for investigative methods that relied on animal instincts, rather than human logic, as the primary guide for locating victims and identifying threats. The December morning when Ruiz found Ekko gone represented more than just the death of a remarkable animal. It marked the completion of a mission that had started years earlier with a pink backpack abandoned by playground swings and had grown into something that challenged everything law enforcement thought it knew about protecting children from predators who had learned to hide in plain sight. Ekko's final resting place beneath the oak tree wasn't chosen randomly. It faced the direction from which morning light arrived each day, as if even in death he was maintaining his vigil over a community that had learned to sleep more peacefully, knowing that someone was always watching for signs of danger that others might miss. The neighbors who gathered for his burial weren't just paying respects to a deceased pet, they were acknowledging the role that Ekko had played in transforming their understanding of how protection actually works in a world where traditional authority structures often fail to recognize threats until after they have claimed victims. Mia Reynolds's placement of Ekko's worn K9 vest on an empty chair during the service created a powerful symbol of presence in absence, a reminder that the work he had started would continue through the network of humans and animals who had learned from his example that persistence and intuition often matter more than official protocols and bureaucratic procedures. The absence of formal speeches at the burial reflected an understanding that Ekko's legacy existed in actions rather than words, in the children who were alive, because he had refused to accept conventional wisdom about what was possible when everyone else had given up hope and moved on to easier problems. The months that followed his death weren't marked by grief as much as by determination to ensure that his supernatural abilities didn't die with him, leading to intensified efforts to identify and train other animals who possessed similar capacities for sensing danger and locating victims in situations where human investigators had exhausted their resources and expertise. The bench that Ruiz built became more than just a memorial. It evolved into a meeting place where law enforcement officers could sit quietly and remember that their most important work often happened in moments when they chose to trust instincts over procedures, when they decided to follow leads that couldn't be justified in official reports, but which led to discoveries that saved lives and exposed networks of evil that had been operating in shadows for years. The toys and treats that continued to appear at the base of the oak tree long after Ekko's death represented a form of ongoing communion between the living and the dead, a recognition that certain spirits remain present in the world even after their physical forms have returned to Earth, continuing to influence events through the memories and inspirations they leave behind in people who were touched by their example. The training of Ekko's replacement became a sacred responsibility rather than just a professional obligation, with Ruiz understanding that he was serving as a bridge between one generation of supernatural investigators and the next, passing along not just techniques and procedures, but also the deeper wisdom about listening to what animals were trying to communicate when conventional training had reached its limits. The success that the new dog achieved in finding the frightened child locked in the janitor's closet proved that Ekko's abilities hadn't been unique to him alone, but rather represented a capacity that existed in many animals who had never been given the opportunity to demonstrate their potential for contributing to child protection efforts in ways that traditional law enforcement methods could never achieve or replace. The child found in the janitor's closet became more than just another successful rescue. She represented proof that Ekko's spiritual legacy was continuing to manifest through animals who had learned to trust their instincts even when human handlers couldn't fully understand or explain what their partners were detecting in situations that appeared routine to everyone else involved. The 6-year-old's fear of calling for help during the fire drill reflected a tragic reality that many children learn early. Sometimes the adults who are supposed to protect them are the same ones who hurt them, creating psychological paralysis that makes rescue impossible until someone arrives who communicates safety through presence rather than words. When Ruiz's new partner froze at the sound of that barely audible whimper, he was demonstrating the same supernatural sensitivity to human suffering that had made Ekko legendary, proving that the ability to sense fear and respond appropriately could be cultivated in animals who were given proper training and handlers who trusted their instincts over official protocols. The little girl's silence during the rescue spoke volumes about the trauma she had endured, but her immediate response to the gentle presence of a dog who asked nothing from her except the opportunity to provide comfort revealed the healing power that animals possess when they are allowed to work as partners rather than tools in human protection efforts. The investigation that followed the closet discovery uncovered a pattern of abuse that had been hidden within the school system itself, protected by institutional loyalty and professional courtesy that had prevented colleagues from reporting suspicious behavior even when children had tried to communicate their fear through behavioral changes that everyone had noticed but no one had been willing to interpret correctly. The network of adults who had been complicit in the abuse, either through direct participation or willful blindness, represented the same kind of organized evil that Ekko had been fighting throughout his career, proving that predators often hide behind positions of trust and authority rather than lurking in shadows like monsters from children's nightmares. The reforms that were implemented in school districts across the region following the exposure of this network included mandatory training in recognizing signs of abuse, but more importantly, they established protocols for bringing in K9 teams specifically trained to detect emotional distress in children who had learned that speaking up about their suffering would only result in more punishment and isolation. The therapeutic programs that paired traumatized children with rescue dogs created healing environments where victims could practice trust again with beings who had no agenda beyond providing comfort and companionship, allowing them to rebuild their capacity for human relationships at their own pace without pressure or expectations. The foster families, who began requesting K9 companions for children who had been rescued from trafficking networks, understood that recovery from such profound trauma required more than traditional therapy. It needed the kind of unconditional acceptance and patient presence that only certain animals could provide consistently over the months and years required for genuine healing. The legislative changes that emerged from documented success stories included funding for expanded K9 programs and legal recognition of animal-assisted therapy as a legitimate component of victim services, creating institutional support for approaches that had previously existed only through the dedication of individual officers and volunteers who believed in methods that couldn't be easily quantified or standardized. The annual memorial service held at Ekko's grave brought together an ever-growing community of people whose lives had been touched by his legacy, creating a living network of protection that extended far beyond any single case or jurisdiction, proving that the ripple effects of heroism continue long after the hero has moved beyond physical presence into the realm of inspiration and memory. The foster home in Sheridan, where Emily recovered from her 2-month captivity, became a laboratory for understanding how animal-assisted therapy could accelerate healing in children who had been systematically dehumanized by their captors, proving that the bond between traumatized kids and rescue dogs created therapeutic breakthroughs that traditional counseling methods had been unable to achieve in years of treatment. Emily's first words after weeks of silence came when she was alone with a retired K9 named Shadow, whispered confessions about the basement where she had been held, and the promises her captors had made about what would happen if she ever tried to escape or call for help. The drawings that Emily created during her recovery sessions revealed details about the network's operations that she had been too frightened to verbalize, sketches of underground rooms, maps of transportation routes, and portraits of faces that helped investigators identify additional suspects who had been operating in other regions under different names and cover stories. The safe house in Montana that was discovered based on Emily's artwork contained evidence of at least 12 other victims who had passed through its chambers over a period of several years, their personal belongings catalogued and stored like inventory in a warehouse that specialized in the destruction of innocence and the commodification of childhood suffering. When federal agents raided the property, they found sophisticated surveillance equipment, communication devices that connected to an encrypted network spanning multiple countries, and financial records that revealed the true scope of an operation that generated millions of dollars annually through the systematic abuse and trafficking of children who had been carefully selected for their vulnerability and lack of family connections. The international connections that emerged from the Montana raid led to coordinated law enforcement actions in Canada, Mexico, and several European countries, resulting in the dismantling of satellite operations that had been feeding victims into the North American network through carefully orchestrated immigration fraud and corrupt adoption agencies that specialized in placing vulnerable children with families who had no intention of providing legitimate homes. The technology discovered at these sites included darknet servers, cryptocurrency wallets containing millions in untraceable funds, and databases containing detailed profiles of hundreds of children who had been evaluated as potential targets based on factors including family stability, school performance, and psychological vulnerability assessments that had been conducted by infiltrators posing as social workers and educational consultants. The rescue operations that followed led to the recovery of 43 children from various stages of the trafficking pipeline, ranging from recent abductees who were still being processed at intake facilities to long-term captives who had been so thoroughly conditioned that they initially resisted rescue attempts and had to be gradually rehabilitated through specialized programs that combined medical treatment with intensive psychological support. The therapeutic kennels that were established at recovery centers provided each rescued child with a specially trained companion animal that had been matched to their specific trauma profile, creating healing partnerships that allowed victims to practice basic human emotions like trust, affection, and hope in relationships that felt safe because the animals made no demands and posed no threats to their carefully constructed psychological defenses. The success rates achieved through these animal-assisted recovery programs exceeded all previous benchmarks for treating severely traumatized children, with 90% of participants showing significant improvement in their ability to form healthy relationships, communicate effectively about their experiences, and transition successfully into adoptive families who had been specially trained to understand the long-term nature of healing from systematic abuse. And you, have you ever witnessed any heroic animal act? Tell us your story in the comments. Don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss the next videos.